A 7-year-old child, locked in a room, bruised, starving, begging for someone, anyone, to hear him. But no one came. How could a father, the one person who should have protected him, be so cold? How could anyone stand by and watch a child slip away? This is the tragic story of Kayden Gavarrete, a little boy who never stood a chance. His cries for help went unanswered, and the system meant to protect him failed him at every turn. His last days were filled with heartache, loneliness, and neglect. What should have been a loving home turned into a place of despair. What would drive someone to fail a child so completely? And how did those closest to him miss the signs? These are the questions that haunt us as we uncover the devastating truths hiding behind closed doors. But before we begin, I just want to take a moment to thank you, my incredible viewers and subscribers. Your likes, shares, and thoughtful comments don't just support this channel. They help keep these stories alive. If you're new here, welcome. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and become part of this growing community that believes every story deserves to be told, and no victim should ever be forgotten. Now, let's get into it. Kayden Gavarrete was the kind of kid who could light up a room with his smile. At just 7 years old, he was already a force of joy and energy, always eager to talk about his favorite superheroes and the video games he loved to play. His eyes would light up as he recounted stories of his favorite characters, his voice filled with that innocent excitement only a child could have. Kaden was full of life, and anyone who knew him couldn't help but be drawn to his infectious energy. His father, Kevin Gavarrete, seemed like any other father at first glance, a man who, in the early days, appeared to care deeply for his son. But beneath the surface, Kevin had flaws that would ultimately cost Kaden more than anyone could have imagined. Kevin had a certain distance in him, a coldness that slowly grew stronger after Tammy Mason, Kaden's mother, tragically passed away in May 2022. Tammy had been the heart of their family, the one who kept everything together. Her unexpected death left a hole in Kaden's life that no one could fill. She was the kind of mother who would do anything for her son, whose love for him was immeasurable. Losing her wasn't just the loss of a parent, it was the loss of stability, the loss of someone who made Kaden feel safe in the world. After Tammy's death, Kaden's world began to crumble. His aunt, Jessica Ryan, had always been close to him, and when Kaden's world fell apart, Jessica tried desperately to stay involved. She reached out, tried to keep in touch with her nephew, but Kevin, in his grief, began to shut everyone out. Despite her attempts, Jessica was pushed away, unable to break through the emotional walls Kevin was building around himself. She knew something wasn't right, but she couldn't do anything to stop the growing distance between her and Kaden, between Kaden and his family. It was as if Kevin's emotional isolation wasn't just affecting him, it was slowly affecting everyone around him, leaving Kaden more and more alone in a world that had already turned upside down. After Tammy's death, Kevin's demeanor shifted in ways that were impossible to ignore. At the burial, his lack of emotion was stark. His focus wasn't on mourning the loss of his wife or supporting his son in the most difficult time of their lives. Instead, Kevin seemed detached, almost disinterested, as if the entire event was something he could just move past. While others were devastated by Tammy's sudden passing, Kevin appeared more concerned with the future than with the grief that should have consumed him. His coldness during the burial was a signal of what was to come, a father who was more wrapped up in his own needs than in caring for the child he had left behind. It didn't take long for Kevin to move on. Just weeks after Tammy's death, Kevin entered a new relationship with Julia Sizemore, a woman he quickly moved into the house with. Social media posts confirmed the timeline. Kevin and Julia had begun dating barely a month after Tammy passed away. The The speed at which Kevin dove into this new relationship seemed to show a complete emotional detachment from the child who had just lost his mother. Kaden, who was already struggling with the loss of his mother, now faced the further reality of his father's indifference. Kevin's focus was no longer on his son. Instead, he became absorbed in his new relationship, leaving Kaden alone to fend for himself emotionally. Kevin's emotional absence became more pronounced, and his priorities shifted. His new life with Julia took center stage, and Kaden was left behind. Julia's presence in the home was inconsistent. Sometimes she'd stay, but more often than not, she would leave for stretches of time, leaving Kaden even more isolated. Her absence and fluctuating presence only added to the confusion and instability in the household, leaving Kaden without any consistent adult support. For him, the inconsistency was painful. One moment, Julia was there, and the next, she was gone. This created an environment where Kaden couldn't depend on anyone, not even the woman who had come into his life as a stepmother. Julia's disrespect for Tammy's memory didn't help the situation. She wasn't just indifferent, she openly showed disdain for Tammy's legacy, and this created immediate tension between Julia and Tammy's family. Tammy's family, who had always been there for Kaden, found themselves increasingly alienated by Julia's actions and attitude. The more she distanced herself from Tammy's memory, the more isolated Kaden became from the only people who might have stepped in to help him. After Tammy's death, the disintegration of the family began in full force. Kaden's grandmother, Anne, who had lived with them, passed away just a few months later, leaving another gaping hole in the fragile support system Kaden had left. But it didn't stop there. Julia's brother and his girlfriend, who had been living with them, moved out shortly after, leaving even fewer people around to witness Kaden's growing isolation and neglect. With fewer eyes on the situation, Kevin and Julia continued their routine, uncaring and unchecked. Kaden, once a vibrant, energetic child, began to shrink into himself. At first, it was subtle. Withdrawn from school, Kaden was supposedly homeschooled, a decision that seemed more about keeping him out of sight than any genuine educational concern. No one checked up on him, and soon enough, he was locked away in his room, his isolation growing each day. Neighbors, who had once seen Kaden playing or walking around, now noticed something different. They rarely saw him at all. His absence became striking. Kevin and Julia, wrapped up in their own lives, took their daughters to Kroger and Walmart, out to stores where they could be seen, while Kaden stayed locked away in the house, alone. Not even a trip to the store, not even a single family outing included him. It was as if he had become invisible, a child erased from the fabric of the home, left to fade in the background. The family dynamics had shifted, and Kaden was no longer part of the picture. He was excluded, and no one seemed to care. Inside the house, Kaden's room was a harsh reflection of the neglect he endured. Minimal furniture, a small bare futon frame, and a dog cage in the corner, left over from when they had puppies. There was no bed, no real comfort. Just a cold, empty space, meant to be his sanctuary, but turned into a prison. Kaden had nowhere to rest his head properly. He slept on a futon, with no blankets, no warmth, no protection from the harsh reality that surrounded him. Kaden was treated like an afterthought, his emotional and physical needs completely unmet. The home was supposed to be a place of love and care, but instead it had become a place of silence and neglect, with no one to listen, no one to care. It wasn't until a relative visited that the extent of Kaden's living conditions became undeniable. She saw him, saw his sleeping arrangements, and was horrified by what she found. The relative immediately stepped in, purchasing a proper bed for Kaden, something so basic yet so essential that had been missing from his life for far too long. This wasn't just a gift, it was a wake-up call. Kaden had been suffering, ignored, alone, and unheard, with no one to ensure his well-being. Meanwhile, Julia's behavior continued to show a complete disregard for Kayden's safety. In September 2022, Julia was arrested for driving while intoxicated with Kayden in the car, a clear sign of her lack of concern for his well-being. She was charged with child endangerment, but once again, this was just another red flag that went unaddressed by the system. Instead of stepping up and ensuring Kayden was safe, Julia was allowed to continue her reckless behavior, unchecked and with no consequences for her actions. Kayden's decline wasn't just physical, it was emotional and psychological too. By May 2024, at just 7 years old, he weighed a fragile 48 pounds, already a worrying sign that his needs were being neglected. But by December 2024, that number had plummeted to a devastating 32 pounds. He had lost 16 pounds in a matter of months, a drastic drop that no one could overlook. His frail, malnourished body was a direct result of the neglect he was suffering. Kevin, the one person who should have been responsible for his care, failed to see what was happening. He failed to get Kayden any medical help, despite the clear signs that his son was starving, both physically and emotionally. Kevin's detachment had grown so complete that he seemed indifferent to Kayden's suffering, unwilling to take the steps necessary to save his son's life. Kayden's physical condition wasn't the only sign of abuse, but Kevin, when confronted with these injuries, had excuses. He blamed Kayden's behavior, claiming that the marks were self-inflicted during emotional episodes. At one point, he suggested that the bruises came from Kayden being near the heating vents, as if that somehow explained the marks on his body. Kevin's justifications were nothing more than a refusal to take responsibility for his actions as a father. He refused to see that these injuries weren't accidental. They were signs of a life lived in constant pain, abandoned by those who should have cared for him. As if all this wasn't enough, there was another chilling detail. While there were gifts for Kevin and Julia's 2 daughters, Kayden had nothing. His absence from family gatherings, his invisible existence in the home, was made even clearer in that moment. He had been forgotten, not just emotionally, but physically as well. The toys, the joy that should have surrounded a child at Christmas, were for everyone except Kayden. This disparity wasn't just a mistake, it was a reflection of how completely Kayden had been excluded, not just from the family, but from any semblance of care or love. There were questions raised by others. Did Kevin keep Kayden in the house because of the financial support he was receiving? After Tammy's death, Kayden started receiving Social Security benefits, and it's possible that Kevin, instead of caring for his son, saw the money as a reason to hold on to him. Kayden was more than just a child to Kevin. He had become a source of income. Was this the reason Kevin, despite all evidence of neglect and abuse, was so willing to keep Kayden around? By this point, the concern of Kayden's family had reached a boiling point. Jessica Ryan, Kayden's aunt, had been trying to keep in touch, desperately wanting to step in and help. She had seen the warning signs, the red flags, that something wasn't right. Kayden's absence from family gatherings, his declining health, the emotional toll it took on him when they did interact, it all pointed to a child who was suffering and being neglected. But every time Jessica reached out, she was met with resistance from Kevin. He kept her and the rest of the family shut out of Kayden's life, refusing to allow them to help. Despite everything, Kayden's family was left powerless, unable to intervene and stop what was happening behind closed doors. However, the very institution that should have been the one to step in failed Kayden. Multiple reports of neglect and abuse had been made, but nothing was done. The concerns raised by Jessica and others went ignored. Despite the clear signs that Kayden was in danger, the system failed to act. This wasn't just a failure of one person, one institution. It was a systemic breakdown, and it left Kayden in a home where his cries for help went unheard. It left a family helpless, frustrated, and angry at their inability to intervene. Kayden's family was left wondering, why didn't anyone help? Why was he allowed to suffer for so long? The truth is, there were too many missed chances, too many failures to act, and in the end, it cost Kayden his life. On December 22, 2024, the authorities arrived at Kevin and Julia's house, and what they found was far worse than anyone could have imagined. Kayden Gavarrete's lifeless body lay in his room, the very room where he had been locked away, isolated and suffering for months. The emotional devastation hit hard, but the true horror was what came next: the delay in calling for medical help. Kevin, who had been home for hours, had waited before finally reaching out for assistance. His story, like so many before, was full of contradictions. First, he claimed that Kayden had been unwell for about a month, but his behavior and condition had worsened dramatically in the days leading up to his death. Kevin's inconsistent statements raised immediate red flags. He said he hadn't checked on Kayden until the following afternoon, after playing video games until 4 a.m., and then sleeping until 2:30 p.m. How could he leave his son, so sick, alone and neglected for hours, and then to wait another hour before calling for help? It was clear Kevin had failed to act in time, and the authorities began to see just how deep his detachment went. The investigators were piecing together the tragic puzzle, but the more they learned, the more they uncovered Kevin's cold indifference. His failure to act when his son was in need was chilling. His attempts to justify his actions only made things worse, further demonstrating his utter lack of care for Kayden's well-being. There was no panic, no urgency to get help. Kevin's calm, almost dispassionate responses to questioning made it clear his son's life was inconsequential to him. And then there was Julia. She too was questioned about the events leading up to Kayden's death, and her inconsistent statements only deepened the investigation's suspicions. First, she claimed to have seen Kayden the day before, but then later admitted she had been around on December 21st, the day before Kayden died. Julia's lack of action during those crucial hours was as telling as Kevin's. She knew something was wrong but did nothing to intervene. Instead, she went about her day, unconcerned with the child who had been left to die in his room. But the investigators were not just focused on the contradictory statements. As they looked around the house, they found something even more troubling: the state of the house itself. It was falling apart. Also, after Kayden's death, Kevin instructed Julia to take their daughters and leave the home, fearing that investigators would take them into protective custody if they saw them there during the investigation. This was part of Kevin's attempt to manipulate the situation, prioritizing his own self-preservation over the safety and well-being of his other children, ensuring they wouldn't face the same fate as Kayden. By the time the authorities began piecing the case together, it was clear that Kayden had been failed on every front. The slow uncovering of the truth revealed the full scope of the neglect and abuse that had been hidden for so long. Kevin and Julia were arrested and faced the weight of the charges against them. The evidence of abuse, starvation, and neglect was overwhelming. But even as the case against them grew stronger, there was a sense of disbelief in the community. How could this happen? How could Kayden be left to die like this? The emotional fallout from Kayden's death rippled through his family. Jessica Ryan, who had tried to intervene and save Kayden, was left to pick up the pieces. She was devastated by the loss of her nephew, but even more by the realization that the family's efforts had been ignored. Kayden had been suffering, and no one had done enough to stop it. Kayden Gavarrete was buried on January 2, 2025. The community found itself not only mourning a life lost too soon, but also grappling with the anger and frustration that came with it. Outside the home where Kayden had spent his final days, a memorial began to take shape. What started as a small gathering of flowers and candles quickly grew into a powerful symbol of the grief felt by those who knew Kayden and those who only heard his story. Stuffed animals, pictures, and handwritten notes filled the area, each item representing someone who had been touched by the tragedy. But the memorial wasn't just a place to mourn. It became a call for change, a demand for justice. The community wasn't going to let Kayden's death be just another forgotten tragedy. They knew something had to change. It wasn't just about remembering Kayden. It was about ensuring that no child ever had to endure what he did. Kayden's family, especially Jessica Ryan, began to channel their grief into something larger, something that could potentially save other children in Kayden's situation. They began advocating for Kayden's Law, a proposed child protection reform designed to address the systemic failures that allowed Kayden's suffering to go unnoticed for so long. The law was intended to make it harder for children to slip through the cracks of the system, to ensure that the warnings were heard, and to make sure that cases of abuse and neglect were taken seriously. Kayden's family pushed for a reform that would demand better oversight, quicker action, and greater accountability from those in charge of child welfare. Kayden's Law was their way of making sure that Kayden's death wasn't in vain, that something positive could come out of the pain and loss they were left with. As you reflect on this heartbreaking story, it's important to ask yourself, how many more children like Kayden are out there right now, living in homes where their cries for help go unheard? What can we do to make sure they're seen, heard, and protected? Kayden's story is one of many, but it doesn't have to be. We all have a part to play in making sure that no child suffers in silence like he did. And that brings us to the heartbreaking end of Kayden's story. A tragedy so disturbing, it makes you wonder how many other children are still suffering in silence, unseen and unheard. What do you think? Should more people have been held accountable for Kayden's death? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched you, be sure to check out more on the channel. Case is just as haunting, just as urgent. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and share this video. By doing so, you help ensure that these stories are never forgotten. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.